Is it still safe to travel to the US? Germany updated their travel advisory for visits to the United States a couple weeks ago, and they're not the only country who did this. So let's take a look at what countries are warning about exactly and the reason behind it all. Hello, servus, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Feli. I'm originally from Munich, Germany, but I've been living here in Cincinnati, Ohio since 2016. And my home country just updated their travel advisory for the country I currently live in, and as of last December, am a citizen of. Specifically, the Federal Foreign Office of Germany added this paragraph on March 18th that says, Reisende sollten ausschließlich mit einem gültigen ESTA oder Visum in die USA reisen, das dem geplanten Aufenthaltszweck entspricht. Vorstrafen in den USA, falsche Angaben zum Aufenthaltszweck oder eine auch nur geringfügige Überschreitung der Aufenthaltsdauer bei Reisen können bei Ein- bzw. Ausreise zu Festnahme, Abschiebehaft und Abschiebung führen. Kontaktieren Sie im Zweifelsfall vor Einreise die zuständige Auslandsvertretung der USA in Deutschland. Which translates to, travelers should only travel to the USA with a valid ESTA or visa that corresponds to the intended purpose of their stay. ESTA is a visa waiver program that people from certain countries, including Germany, can apply for online. You just put in your information, pay a small fee of $21, and then you usually find out pretty quickly whether it was approved or not, and you'll receive a confirmation that you can then show at the border instead of an actual visa in your passport. The ESTA program allows people to stay in the US as a tourist for up to 90 days at a time, but the exact end date for each stay is always determined upon entry by the immigration officer. Then it says, previous convictions in the USA, false information about the purpose of stay, or even a slight overstay when traveling can lead to arrest, detention, and deportation upon entry or exit. If in doubt, contact the relevant US diplomatic mission in Germany before entering the country. The advisory also says that neither a valid ESTA authorization nor a valid US visa entitles the holder to enter the USA. The final decision is made by the US border official. But this last section has actually been part of the advisory for a while, and this is the case in most countries, that the final decision to let a person in or not usually lies with the border official. What triggered this change to the travel advisory was a number of recent cases where tourists and immigrants have been detained in the US, including German citizens. A spokesman for the German Foreign Office said the ministry was taking these incidents very seriously and that they were monitoring how German citizens are treated when traveling to the United States. Before they eventually decided to adjust the travel advisory, the ministry said they were trying to assess, quote, whether this represents a change in American immigration policy or whether these are isolated cases. Once we have a clear picture, we will then, if necessary, adjust our travel and security advice, which they then did on March 18th. However, it's important to point out that this isn't an official travel warning, it's just an amendment to the travel advisory as of right now. There are 3 cases in particular that have stood out in the last couple of months where German citizens were detained in the US. The first one is the story of 29-year-old Jessica Brussia, a tattoo artist from Berlin who was on vacation in Mexico when she decided to visit one of her best friends in Los Angeles for a few weeks before returning to Berlin. Based on the information available on this case, her friend, who's an American citizen, drove down to the border in Tijuana to meet her, and together they attempted to cross the border into the US by foot at the San Isidro port of entry. This was on January 25th. Jessica had all the required documentation, including her valid passport, her ESTA authorization, as well as a return flight to Germany for February 15th. But instead of being allowed to enter the US with her friend, she was not only denied entry, but actually detained by US Customs and Border Protection, which, according to what I read about this case, is not very common. Usually people in this situation are simply sent back to Mexico or given the option to get a flight to their home country. In an interview with CNN, Jessica's friend, whose name is Nikita Loving, said, "They took her right in front of me as we were walking over. 2 hours passed, and then she called me and said, "Hey, I'm gonna get deported back to Germany. I'll call you from Germany in a couple of days." But that call never came because Jessica was kept in detainment for weeks without an official charge. Allegedly, the reason behind all of this was that the border control officers suspected that Jessica was gonna try to work during her stay since she had her tattoo equipment on her, which would have been in violation of her ESTA tourist visa. But according to Nikita, Jessica only planned on tattooing her as a friend and wasn't planning to work for money. Jessica reported that she was first detained at the border for a few days before she was transferred to the Otay Mesa Detention Center, a facility in San Diego that belongs to ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. At least 8 of those days she spent in solitary confinement, she says.
She says it was like a horror movie. They were screaming in all different rooms. After 9 days, she said she went so insane that she started punching the walls, and then she's got blood on her knuckles on the walls.
Despite being willing to leave the country and return back home to Germany, Jessica was held for a total of 6 weeks before she was finally released on March 11th and sent to Germany. To this day, it's not clear why she was detained for so long instead of being deported immediately or sent back to Mexico. According to her friend Nikita, the experience was extremely traumatic. This New York Times article quotes Nikita as follows: "Just the sheer fact of not knowing what's going on drove her insane. She could barely sleep the whole time she was in there. She was up at night crying." If you guys want to help Jessica out to recover from this experience, there is a GoFundMe set up for her that I'm gonna link down below if you're interested. Also, just a quick disclaimer, please keep in mind that I personally can't guarantee that all of this information about these cases is 100% true, as I don't have access to these people's files, and I obviously wasn't there for it. This is simply the information that's publicly available right now, so whether every single detail is true, none of us can know that for sure, but as of right now, there's no evidence available to the public that suggests otherwise either. That being said, another case that made a lot of headlines was that of 25-year-old Lukas Silav from Sachsen-Anhalt. He was arrested on February 18th at the same border crossing as Jessica. He originally came to the US on January 27th to visit his fiancée, Dr. Lennon Tyler, a psychologist from Las Vegas, who he met in Prague in 2022. A couple weeks later, the two went to Mexico to get medical treatment for Lennon's dog, but when they tried to re-enter the US, Lukas wasn't let back in because the officers suspected that he had been living in the US long-term, thereby violating his ESTA tourist visa, and that he had taken the trip to Mexico to get around the 90-day limit. Apparently, Lukas had trouble understanding the officers, and there may have been some misunderstandings during the initial interrogation. He stated that he repeatedly asked for a translator, but his request was denied. After first being chained to a bench and then having to sleep on a bench for 2 nights, Lukas was transferred to the Otay Mesa Detention Center in San Diego, where he shared a cell with 8 other people, and stated that there was 1 microwave for more than 120 people who would all get in long lines when it was time to eat. He describes the experience as horrible.
You only can get out 3 times a day when nothing happens. They can put you on lockdown if you don't behave there. And it's just awful. They try to break your mind.
Even his fiancée Lennon, an American citizen, was subjected to a car search at the border, a body search, and had to give her fingerprints. And when she questioned whether all of this was legal and asked for a supervisor, she was chained to a bench for about 4 hours before she was allowed to go home.
They take me over to a bench. They chain my ankle to a bench. Hours go by.
You're saying you, as a U.S. citizen, were detained and you had your ankles shackled to the ground.
Yes, that's right.
After that day at the border, she immediately hired immigration lawyers, reached out to the German consulate for help, and called the immigration authorities every day until after 2 weeks of detention, Lukas was finally allowed voluntary deportation and arrived back in Germany on March 6th. He said that during all of this time, he never received any information about his case, and he claims that he has never overstayed a visa and has no criminal history. After his release, he said in an interview, "Sometimes I just wake up because I have nightmares of the situation and what happened, and I just try to go for walks and calm down." Then there's the case of Fabian Schmidt, which I personally first heard about in a Facebook group for Germans living abroad that I'm a member of. A few weeks ago, a German woman named Astrid posted that her son, Fabian, a legal permanent resident of the US, was detained by ICE at the Boston airport, and she asked the Facebook community for recommendations regarding an immigration lawyer. A few days later, the case popped up all over the news. 34-year-old Fabian Schmidt and his mom legally came to the US in 2007 when he was a teenager and received a green card 1 year later. Ever since then, the US has been Fabian's home. He works as an electrical engineer, has an 8-year-old daughter, and currently lives in New Hampshire with his American girlfriend. On March 7th, Fabian was returning from a trip to Germany to visit his father when he was detained and interrogated at the border. According to his mother, he was yelled at by officials, stripped naked, hosed down with cold water, and then placed on a mat in a bright room with other people where he was given little food and water, suffered sleep deprivation, and was denied access to his medication for anxiety and depression. He ended up collapsing and was brought to Massachusetts General Hospital, where he was diagnosed with influenza, so the flu. During his stay at the hospital, he was tied to the bed. Then he was brought to the Wyatt detention facility in Rhode Island, where he's been detained ever since. Fabian's lawyers stated that during Fabian's interrogations, the officers used the tactic of duress, which basically means that threats and psychological pressure were used to get him to sign away his green card, which he didn't end up doing. The lawyer also said that they still haven't gotten any official charges and therefore don't know why Fabian was arrested. His mother Astrid mentioned in interviews that he was repeatedly asked about a misdemeanor charge from 2015 when he was caught with marijuana in his car back when he lived in California. But when California changed its laws around marijuana possession, the case had been dismissed. However, apparently he was supposed to attend a hearing about this case in 2022, but never showed up because the invitation wasn't forwarded to his new address in New Hampshire. Whether or not this is the reason for his arrest still isn't clear though. His mother said that in 2023, Fabian misplaced his physical green card and his request for a replacement was granted without any issues. So she wonders why the problem about the hearing wouldn't have been brought up then. The German Consulate General in Boston is in contact with American authorities about the case, and the German Foreign Office stated in a press conference on March 17th, "Of course, we expect our partners to ensure that prison conditions meet international human rights standards and that detainees are treated accordingly, just as we expect of all countries around the world." US Customs and Border Protection has called the allegations of mistreatment in regard to Fabian's case blatantly false, by the way. On March 24th, Fabian finally received a date for a hearing, but it won't be until June, and it's not clear yet whether or not he'll be allowed to get out on bail before that. Fabian's family has started a GoFundMe page for him to pay all of the legal fees and make up for the loss of income while he's in detainment, and there's also an Instagram page to keep people updated on his situation. I'm gonna link both of those pages down below in case you're interested. And these are just a few of the many stories of legal immigrants being detained and deported recently. You may have also heard of the cases of Canadian actress and entrepreneur Jasmine Mooney, who was detained for 12 days, Welsh graphic artist Rebecca Burke, who was detained for 19 days, the Turkish PhD student Ramesa Öztürk, who is still currently detained, Brown University doctor Rasha Alawi, who was detained and deported to Lebanon, Mahmoud Khalil, a graduate student at Columbia University and a green card holder who is currently being detained for his pro-Palestinian activism, or Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was falsely deported to a violent prison in El Salvador, which the White House described as an administrative error, but they were still unable to bring him back until now. Garcia's case was part of an effort to deport Latin American gang members, for which President Trump even invoked the 1798 Alien Enemies Act that allows for the expulsion of foreign nationals during wartime. Legal experts, both within the US and abroad, have voiced concerns in the last few weeks about the fact that this law allows the government to deport people without the right to due process. Again, these are just a few of the cases that have gained public attention recently, and of course there have also been numerous deportations of undocumented immigrants, and hundreds of international students have had their F1 student visas revoked in the last few weeks. That's the visa I used to be on myself. In lieu of all of this, Germany isn't the only country that updated their travel advisory for the US. The UK too added this paragraph in March. You should comply with all entry, visa, and other conditions of entry. The authorities in the US set and enforce entry rules strictly. You may be liable to arrest or detention if you break the rules. And Canada actually just updated their travel advisory for the second time since January, now emphasizing individual border agents often have significant discretion in making those determinations. US authorities strictly enforce entry requirements. Expect scrutiny at ports of entry, including of electronic devices. Comply and be forthcoming in all interactions with border authorities. If you're denied entry, you could be detained while awaiting deportation. A lot of countries, including Germany, also specifically added sections for people who are trans, non-binary, or hold a third gender passport, since the US has switched to recognizing only 2 biological sexes. The Danish travel advisory reads, if your passport has the gender designation X, or you have changed gender, it is recommended to contact the US Embassy prior to travel for guidance on how to proceed. Finland, Ireland, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Germany have published similar guidelines. Another topic that's been widely discussed in the last few weeks among people traveling to the US is phone searches. Just a few weeks ago, a French scientist who was traveling to a conference near Houston was reportedly denied access to the US after immigration officers searched his phone and found messages in which he had expressed criticism of the Trump administration. Now, it doesn't usually happen a lot, but US border control is in fact allowed to search people's phones and other electronic devices. That's why experts now advise people to turn their phones off before going through immigration and to deactivate Face or fingerprint ID, because if your phone requires an actual passcode to be accessed, officers can't force you to disclose that. However, if they can't access your device, they might confiscate it for a longer period of time and eventually send it back to you. Some people even recommend bringing a burner phone to the US instead of your real phone. So does that mean that it's not safe to come to the US right now? Quite honestly, that's a question that I don't think anyone can give you a straight answer to right now. We'll have to observe how this plays out in the future and whether these really were just isolated cases or whether this is becoming more of a pattern for people traveling to the US. But as of right now, it's safe to say that thousands of visitors and returning immigrants enter the US every day without any issues, so statistically speaking, most people visiting are gonna be just fine. At the same time, seeing tourists, green card holders, and people with other long-term visas being deported and detained at that rate is a relatively new development. So I personally don't find it surprising that a lot of people are being cautious and don't want to risk anything by coming to the US right now. Better safe than sorry, right? I even know of a few fellow immigrants who are here legally who don't even dare to go on a domestic flight right now, just in case. For me personally, I'm very glad that I got my US citizenship a few months ago. It definitely makes me feel more protected in all of this. And I actually went on a domestic flight to New York City last month, but also, just in case, I actually brought both my American passport and my German passport on the trip, when technically I only needed my US driver's license to fly. But I figured, in case I somehow end up in a situation where I need to prove my legal status, I want to be prepared. That's something I wouldn't have done a few months ago. Now, what have your experiences been traveling to the US from abroad? Whether you're a citizen or you just came as a tourist. Let's exchange some experiences in the comments below. And of course, if you do have a trip to the US planned, don't panic, just make sure that you have all of the necessary documents with you to prove the purpose of your visit, and always make sure you have your flight back home booked and bring the booking confirmation so that they know that you're not trying to stay in the US long term. The next video will be more lighthearted again, I promise. Make sure to subscribe to my channel if you enjoy what I do on here, and if you want to support me beyond that, you can always send me a little tip on PayPal, via the super thanks function, or via Patreon or Ko-fi.com. My last video before this one was demonetized again, so it would be greatly appreciated. But either way, thank you guys so much for your support, and I hope I'll see you next time. Tschüss!